welcome to this Inequality Conversations organized by the Center for Public Policy at IIM Bangalore. So today we have the fifth session of this Inequality Conversations, where we have Professor Hema Swaminathan, who is a professor at the Center for Public Policy at IIM Bangalore. Hema's research is in the broad area of poverty and inequality, and she uses gender inequality as one of her main area of research. So today she's going to talk about women's legal rights and inequality in economic resources, a global perspective. So yeah, Hema, you can start.
Thank you very much, Soham, and to Sriram for putting together this inequality series. So today I'm going to focus, as Soham said, I'm going to sort of look at what laws and legislations are around economic resources, taking a gender perspective and looking at inequality in economic resources. So gender inequality here, I've specified, like the title says, I've specified the economic aspects of gender inequality, and I'm going to look largely at income and wealth, assets and wealth, bearing in mind that all of these are mediated by the labor market, legislations, and social norms. We are not going to spend too much time talking about the role of norms. We are going to focus much more on laws and policies. But one has to remember that the social norms are always in the background. They are not exogenous. To some extent, laws and legislation help push social norms, help them become more progressive. But conversely, also social norms and social movements are also what can bring about changes in legislations to make them more gender progressive. And why economic resources? Why the focus on economic resources? Gender inequality is actually pervasive in all domains of life, or several domains of life. You could say social, cultural, economic, political, religious, where have you, there is stark gender inequality. But economic empowerment, I very strongly believe, is what can be really transformative. It's foundational, not just about economic freedom and access to economic resources, but it's also about agency, confidence, and all of which lead to other forms of empowerment. So when you're employed in the formal labor market, of course the money matters, but also what matters is the fact that you're out there could be value for your work, you're building networks, you're meeting peers, irrespective of the kind of work. I mean, I'm not necessarily talking only about very formal kinds of work, but even for informal kinds of work, when you're out there, you have a bunch of people, probably other women, right? So you're building your networks, you're getting out of the house, you have agency, you have some more confidence, it's tied to mobility, which is why the focus I have taken is much more on economic empowerment. And this is where also I think legislations and policies have a role to play. Right? So some of the common arguments that we hear are when we talk about, say, discrimination in the labor market, or we talk about the fact that women don't earn as much as men do, is that people will say, well, these are choices that women have made. They have low skills. They go to occupations that are low returns. It's because they don't have an appetite for risk. And then there are also another arguments around social constructed identities and gender stereotypes of what men can do and what women can do in society, right? Well, we leave these arguments right here. I'm not going to get into all of this, but I do want you to keep at the back of your mind that choices that women make, or the skills that they have, or their roles in society, nothing has just fallen out of the sky. So if women have a low occupation, if they have skills that are not as good as men's, or they don't have skills in STEM fields or in fields that earn a very high return, that's because of there's certain discrimination that they might have already encountered in education in how certain gender identities were formed, in what they were told that women could aspire for and that what boys could aspire for. Right? And many studies have shown that risk preferences of men and women are not necessarily very different if you give them certain, put them in certain situations. Right? It's also true that the kind of work that women do tends to be undervalued, like the care economy. They do unpaid care work at home, but if you look at the care economy in general, that's a much lower paying occupation than, say, STEM fields where women are underrepresented. So these are some of the common arguments that we hear. But what we don't hear is how much state sanctioned discrimination women face. With respect to economic resources or accessing economic opportunity so that they can enjoy it to the fullest, right? And that's what I'm sort of going to talk about. It's a very broad brush a sort of story that I'm going to tell you because like I said, it's a global perspective. I don't want to focus only on India, but here and there I will sprinkle in a few more Indian examples. Right. So if you look at gender inequality in labor income, and this graph is from the the World Inequality Report. It's sort of where we started off with the idea of this inequality conversations. It's telling you that the female labor income shares are across the world for 2019, right? So as the lighter shades denote that there is very low women earn, their labor share is very low. If women were earning equally, it would be at 50%. So if you look at India, it's sort of a light blue, it's only at 18%, whereas it's around 41% in France. It's quite high in the East European countries, in the East European bloc. Also not very surprising because historically they had very high labor force participation rates. China is one shade lower. Western Europe is doing again quite well. If you look at parts of sub-Saharan Africa, there are some countries where it's very low, where women's labor share is very low, but there are a few countries where it's very high. So this is just a snapshot broadly to say that women's labor, the share of labor income earned by women is not anywhere close to what men earn. Okay? And that was like a global snapshot. Here, what I'm going to show you here is if you look at a sample of households, so you're looking at intra-household allocation of income, right? So you can think of gender inequality in two ways. One is at the population level, you're looking at averages between men and women, or you can think of it as an intra-household level where you're comparing labor income or labor earnings between a husband and a wife, right? So this is looking at it for 39 countries for years, roughly spanning from about 2010 to about 2016. And so each little facet is an individual country. So you have 39 countries out here. And it's looking at what the median income is for women when both members of a couple are earning, which is called a positive earnings, and that's sort of the greenish line. And then there's the red line, which tells you what it is women's share of couple earnings when at least one person is employed, right? So obviously the red line is going to be lower than the green line. So the dotted line gives you the median for the positive earning sample, whereas the solid line gives you the median earnings for the full earning sample. So if you look at India, you will see is sort of the median earning is for the full sample is almost zero, which is not surprising. It tells you the fact that women's labor force participation in India is very low, right? Because you've considered all couples for a nationally represented data set. So given the percent of women who are actually earning a labor income is so low, the median is effectively close to zero or almost at zero. Whereas if you look at the full sample, if you look at the positive sample, the median earnings are higher and stand roughly at about 33%, right? But the takeaway from this point is that fact that in no country on average within household is a wife making as much as her husband is, right? If she was, then it would be 50%. So on average, In no country are women making as much as their husbands do. And this does not change across the income distribution. You might expect it to change as households get richer. Maybe women are more educated and maybe they're making choices which suggests that they will actually earn more than their husbands, but that's not true. Even at the top end of the earning distribution, you'll find that women's earnings are not matching up to men's earnings, and this is true across a diverse set of countries. Right? What are some of the reasons for gender inequality in labor income? Right? One is that we think about labor market participation, right? Whether you work or you don't work. And this is what we would call the extensive margin, right? How many women are actually participating in the labor market? What kinds of choices are being made? And then conditional on what participating, what is the intensity of work? How many hours do women actually work? And what kinds of, whether it's full time, whether it is part time, what are the kinds of occupations that they are in, and what and how well remunerated or otherwise these jobs are, right? So you have both the extensive margin, which is the number of women working, and the intensive margin, which would actually be the hours of work that they can, right? So that would be your differentiation. And here we will see that there is a big difference in the hours that women actually put in compared to the men. In a country like India, we know that labor force participation of women is quite low. I think it's around maybe 25 to 30%. So the last BLFS actually showed an increase in women's participation. Why and what is driving it is actually a matter of quite intense debate. But in general, it has been low, but conditional on participating, what is the intensity of work, right? So the earnings are actually a function of all of these issues, right? The kind of work you do, your engagement in the labor market, or your attachment to the labor market, right? And what are the legislations that can actually impact women's ability to fully participate in the labor market? There are many legislations that actually impact, but let's look at two broad ones. One is just plain discrimination in employment. Can employers discriminate on the basis of gender? Right? And is there discrimination in wages? So if you look at this is just data from the World Bank, which is called they have a website called Women, Business and Law that actually collects some very interesting gender data on countries around the world and quotes them and creates indices, etc., that we can use, but there's also indicators, right? So based on this indicator, if you look at this map, the world does not look too bad, because yes means that the law prohibits discrimination in employment based on gender, right? The world looks kind of orangish, which is a yes, and there are very small blue pockets here and there, which indicates that this kind of discrimination in employment is not prohibited, right? So broadly, broad brush, this seems like good news, right? But what I want to get into, like India also, of course, says that a law prohibits discrimination in employment. But very recently, there was a very interesting report that was released by an organization called, I think, Trias, that put together what is called a state of discrimination index for the various states in India. So this is it's a close subnational look at our states. So they did an analysis of 48 acts, 169 rules, and 20 notifications and orders, right? And so globally and also in India, work can be classified into various types. So there is work that's done at night, work that is deemed hazardous, work deemed arduous, and jobs that are deemed morally inappropriate, right? Night jobs needs no explanation. Hazardous jobs, an example of that would be, say, working with inflammables or working with pesticides kind of stuff. Arduous, where there is involvement of lifting of very heavy weights, and morally inappropriate, an example is the sale of liquor. So there is some classification of this, and this is actually telling you it's created an index of states. So greater the rating, greater the freedom. But you will see that jobs deemed arduous, almost all states restrict women from working. Many states also restrict women from working at night. jobs deemed hazardous slightly better, and in jobs deemed morally inappropriate, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Goa, Himachal, broadly, even at the index that is created, these are the 4 states that stand out as having the least amount of restrictions on women, whereas West Bengal, Odisha have some of the highest restrictions on women, right? So while the broad data, say, that's collected by the World Bank says that discrimination based on gender is prohibited, and we can sort of feel good about the country. I'm specifically looking at India. Of course, it was not possible for me to look at subnational level across the world. But at the subnational level, we actually see there are restrictions on women's employment, right? Women working at night. Why? And if you talk to someone, they'll say, oh, it's fine. It's perfectly all right. It's for her own safety, right? So what you need to do is actually improve law and order. You have to ensure that there isn't any kind of harassment, like women. I mean, just because I'm a woman doesn't mean I have to be home at sunset, right? So you have to ensure that identities are constructed in such a way that violence is not inflicted at women, that you bring up your voice to respect women, and that there is law and order in the streets, that the police are doing their job. Jobs seem morally inappropriate. The sale of liquor, right? So women cannot do. So every kind of restriction that you have is actually a restriction on her ability to get out and have the opportunity to work in an area that she thinks appropriate. So here, this is the state that is deciding for women what they can do and what they cannot do. Of course, some states have on a basis, I mean, people have taken, I think Maharashtra, there was a court case, a lady took a particular employer to court and some restriction was overturned, right? But this is a very paternalistic view that the state has of women and what they can do and what they can't do, instead of making the broad climate such that every citizen feels empowered to do what they think is right. Then we have discrimination in wages, right? So whether the law mandates equal remuneration for men and women for work of equal value, India doesn't. We don't have this law, and that is also true for several other countries. In North America, it's the US. We have China, some countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Brazil, Mexico, all of it, right? So even though countries might have law that restricts, that does not restrict employment based on gender, there isn't a law which says that you have to pay males and females for work of equal value, right? So very interestingly, I think, was it about a couple of years ago, or maybe just last year, they did a gender audit in many countries in UK, where you actually had to put out what you paid men and what you paid women for work of similar rank and of equal value. And not all companies, I mean, making this mandatory to publish this kind of data is very important, right, in terms of bringing about transparency. But in many corporates, of course, in a government job, your wages are public, what you make as salary is public, but many corporates actually have employees sign a NDA, a non-disclosure agreement at the time of joining, which says that your wages are, your salary is private information and that you cannot discuss it with anyone, right? So that really just opens the room to discrimination based on gender. Some of this discrimination, people will say, is because women are not working hard enough, they're not putting in the kind of hours that men do, right? So let's see some of the ways in which this plays out. Women experience what is called a motherhood penalty. This is a term that has been coined, I think, largely maybe by economists, but it really talks about the negative impact of childbirth and childcare on women's labor market outcomes, right? What that means is that when you hire a young woman, you think that first, even before we get a motherhood penalty, people are busy on the recruitment panel. It's going through their heads. Oh, she's young. Maybe she's going to get married. What if she moves? She might not stay here very long, right? And then they're thinking about once she's married, what happens? Maybe she'll have a child. As someone once told me recently, my employers are doing my family planning for me. rather than I am, because they have thought about when I'll have my first child and when I'll have my second child. So I thought that was a very interesting example, actually, right? This motherhood penalty actually holds globally, irrespective of the level of economic growth or formalization of the labor market. Right? So women actually, when their career takes a backseat, there is a sharp drop in earnings. But interestingly, there is no fatherhood penalty. Right? So it's as if it's mothers are actually penalized for biological reproduction, but whereas the fathers, I'm not saying they are lauded for reproduction, but they don't experience what women go through, at least in the labor market, right? So this is data from Denmark, administrative population level data from Denmark, from a a paper that's become very famous now, like Clevin et al. It's actually showing you very nicely. So this red line is the first childbirth, right? So, and that's an event. And they're looking at the long run penalty of what happens when children are born. And if you look at the bolded line is that of a woman, and the gray line is that of a male. So what's happening when there's a birth of the first child, right? Almost no change in the earnings of the father, but there is a sharp drop in the earnings of the woman, which might be fine in the first couple of years, but then you find that it never recovers, right? Even after 10 years post-event, there is no recovery in the earnings of the woman, right? And if you look at hours worked, again, it's similar. The drop is not so sharp, but there is a drop. So the hours that women work don't sort of recover. And this is Denmark, a country that's sort of fairly famous for family-friendly policies, family-friendly childcare, where there is public childcare. But still, it's women who are bearing the brunt of it. Again, as part of this paper, the authors have also, I think, correlated with values and who do you think should stay at home. And it's all tied to socially constructed roles of gender and what being a good mother means and what it means in terms of childcare, right? So biological reproduction is also tied very much with social reproduction, which is the whole bit of childcare and and domestic maintenance and what it means to be a good mother. Right? So this is true. Also, not say, well, this is data for Denmark. In India, we don't really have this kind of panel data that helps us, nor do we have administrative data that helps us. But motherhood penalty does operate. I mean, there have been audit studies or correspondence studies where a same set of CVs have been given to employers and ask them, would you recruit? So the only thing that has been changed are maybe the sex of the person who is of the potential applicant, and maybe there is somewhere they have thrown in information about whether they are on school committees and stuff like that. All of this has impacted women's chances to be hired, but it hasn't really impacted men's chances to be hired, right? So the motherhood penalty very much operates, right? So let's see some of the mechanisms of the motherhood penalty and how it works. And globally, we all know that women do a bulk of unpaid care work, what we call as social reproduction, because that is childcare, elderly care, and domestic maintenance, right? So this data is from the 2019 ILO that they've compiled together time use surveys, and you find that the average time of unpaid work done by women is about 276 minutes in a 24-hour period, whereas for men it's 110. And the average time of paid work for women is 152 and it's 266 for men, right? So there's a huge imbalance here. So if we want I think there are two issues here. One, this shows that women are doing the bulk of unpaid care work. And B, it shows that if women have to take on more, if we want to encourage women to go more into the formal labor market, then there has to be a redistribution of this unpaid work that happens at home, right? There has to be a redistribution between men and women, but one can also take the context outside and say it's not just about redistribution between men and women. There's also a role for the state to come in by providing publicly provided childcare, publicly provided elderly care. What is it that the state can do so that unpaid care can also become part of employment generation right, in economic terms. But anything that has to do with home and care, the state has either totally absconded or is absconding, right? So there's very little involvement of the state in thinking about creating jobs around these kinds of issues, and they disproportionately affect women. So if you look at paid leave of at least 14 weeks available to mothers, you'll find that not all countries give this. India, of course, the latest Maternity Benefits Act of 2017 has enhanced paid leave to mothers to 26 weeks. But the most famous case here is of the United States, which though is a sort of is considered part of the global north, and a rich country, developed country, it stands in aberration to the other OECD, I think all the other OECD countries, and that paid leave is not guaranteed under the federal law. It's a state subject. Often women have to combine it with all other kinds of leave to get paid leave. Right? But what happens to paternity leave for men? Right? You find there is paid paternity leave. It's almost non-existent in many countries. In India, it says no, because although there is 15 days paternity leave, it's only in the government sector. That's only for the public offices. Corporates are not mandated to give the 15 days, or many companies actually do, but it is not necessary from the point of view of the, it's not a rule that they have to follow that's given by the government. India's Maternity Act, the legislation is also highly problematic, right? Because it gives 26 weeks off to the mother and it gives 2 weeks to the father, right? Which essentially says that infant care is only a mother's job. And the bigger problem here is also that the Maternity Act, there is no government support to companies to ensure that they can give paid leave of 26 weeks to the new mothers. So companies that your big multinationals might be able to afford it, your big government offices are able to afford it. But what about your regular smallish establishments, right, of which actually generate the maximum amount of employment in the country? They cannot afford to. They cannot afford to have someone on their rolls for 6 months and give them full paid leave. So obviously what happens is, in fact, a study, I think that was done by an organization, I forget which one, showed that actually this was hurting women's recruitment, because you're busy thinking, oh, if I hire her, I now have to pay for her whenever she gets pregnant and she goes on maternity leave, right? So this is fairly poorly thought out, because the government hasn't actually provided the financial resources to the company, and it has also given this leave only to mothers. There's nothing called paternity leave, or there's nothing called family leave. So it has now made it far more attractive to recruit a man than to recruit a woman, right? So what might be thought of as a sort of a gender progressive law is actually very regressive. What it's doing is actually hard coding gender roles in society. And that's true of when you give flexible work hours only to mothers. It's a huge problem, because the message that is being sent out there is only mothers with young children who can do flexible work. Is that mothers are responsible for childcare. Fathers don't have a role, or so it seems, beyond the biological reproduction. They are not part of childcare. And this hurts both really men and women. You might think that it hurts only mothers. Of course, it hurts mothers, because if you take flexible work hours and you're working from home, your employer is going to think, oh, maybe she's also doing the laundry, or maybe she's also cooking a meal, or she's looking after her child. All of which might be true. And you're saying that, okay, now that she's become a mother, her priorities are not with the company, her productivity is going to take a hit. And so because you're thinking of women as caregivers. And so she's lost out on a lot of networking opportunities that are available at work. She has lost out perhaps that promotion that she might have got, or that exciting project that she would have got. And then you're also telling the fathers, hey, it's okay, your child is born, just come back. It's assuming that the child of this young man has a young woman or a mother back home who's looking after him. So it's actually very problematic when you have legislations that mandate only maternity leave, when you have institutions that give you only flexible work hours only for women, it's a big problem. Actually, there might be young men nowadays who might want to be at home, right? But they're not given the opportunity because they are in this rat race where they have to prove themselves with other men. So the laws and the policies have to actually be norm makers. They have to push and change the norms, not be sort of norm makers in a regressive sense. Right? So this is really very discriminatory. So when people tell you that the labor market is neutral, it's not. It's not a neutral institution at all. It's largely very patriarchal in nature, and it follows certain roles, gendered roles for men and women. Right? So this was largely talking, I think, a broad brush picture of what laws and legislations are out there in the labor market, how they can impact your earnings. And now I sort of want to talk similarly about gender inequality in assets and wealth, right? And why quickly a little bit about why assets, right? Because assets are fundamentally, wealth and assets are fundamentally different from income and consumption, which is, I mean, it's economists often use assets to make a difference between structural poverty and temporary or transient poverty. And then property ownership, if you own a house, if you own a land, it gives you a great amount of security. Even if your income flow is reduced or it's stopped, you have something to fall back upon. You have a place to live. You are not homeless. And then it's very important for transmission, intergenerational transmission of social status, what you bequeath, which many people want to do, and it also serves as collateral for loans. So fundamentally, income, consumption are kind of one. Income is sort of one way to think about economic resources. Assets and wealth are a different way to think about economic resources, because at some point you will also stop earning. Even if you're in the labor market, you will stop earning, and that's when your assets and say your wealth, lots of places don't have public pensions, it's your wealth that's going to be important for you in as you get older. It serves as your social security, right? So this is from DHS data, which is just giving you a broad map of home ownership by men and women. I think the takeaway point is that, of course, not there isn't 100% home ownership for men as well. But the takeaway point is that across countries, there are very, I think, few countries where women's home ownership rates is similar to men, and similarly so for land. In fact, it's probably a bit lower on the land, right? So this is DHS data that collects this information on whether men and women in a household own land. Again, this is actually an area where data collection is a little weak. We don't have as good data on property ownership as we do have on income. That's because we don't have it disaggregated, at least in a lot of developing countries. We don't have it disaggregated by sex. In developed countries, one has recourse to long-run panels, or one also has recourse to tax returns and administrative data. Right? And how are assets largely acquired? The modes of asset acquisition become very important when we think about how men and women acquire and accumulate assets. So there are various channels. One is through marriage, one is through inheritance, and one is through markets. And these are the three channels. And then there are gifts and transfers and government programs as well. But these are the first three are the channels that I will focus on mostly now, because that's where there is a role for policies and legislations, right? And so we'll just take a look at how these impact men and women differently, right? Marriage and inheritance in most developing countries are the principal channels for both women and men to acquire property. So a project called the Gender Asset Gap Project that I was involved in, which conducted sex almost for the first time. It pioneered the data collection of individual level asset data in three countries, India, Ghana, and Ecuador. India, it was representative for the state of Karnataka, found that a majority of agricultural land is actually inherited, right? No surprises there. In India, it's as high, in Karnataka, it's as high as 86%, whereas in Ecuador and Ghana, it was it was 53 and 59%, respectively, right? So when we're thinking of marriage and inheritance, it becomes very important to try and understand what are the national legislations that guide the division of marital assets. So there is something called a full community of property. So there are three kinds of marital regimes. a full community of property, partial community of property, and what we call separation of property, where the concept of community of property does not exist. When we say full community of property, what that means is all assets are considered as joint property of the couple. So from the point at which you enter into a union, either a marriage union or a consensual union or a partnership, anything that is recognized legally under the law, there is this concept of full community of property. What this means is that anything that I have brought into the marital union and anything that we accumulate post the date of the union is considered marital assets as joint property of the couple. Then you have partial community of property, which says that assets that are acquired post the formation of the marital union or during marriage is considered joint property. But anything that spouses bring individually into the marriage is independent, is their own and what they want to do with it, right? So they retain control over what they have brought in independently, but anything going forward beyond the marital union is considered joint property. And then there is separation of property where all property is individually owned. What that means is I bring something into the marriage that is individually owned, and anything that is accumulated in the marriage is also individually owned. So suppose I'm married and I go out and I purchase a house and that house happens to be registered only in my name, then that belongs only to me. My husband doesn't have a say, doesn't have any legal rights over it if the marriage is dissolved. So women actually, what works best for women is the concept of community of property regime, right? Because what this allows is that it recognizes that women have a role in the accumulation of marital property through their social reproductive roles. So India actually has a separation of property. So let me try to unpack this point a little more. So India has a separation of property, which actually means that what I bring to marriage remains mine, and what I accumulate post-marriage is also mine if it has my name. So in a country like India, which is largely patriarchal and where women's labor force participation is very low, then women are not really able to participate in the market for property or in the market for high valued assets. So they don't have earnings of their own through which they can purchase. Or it is also possible that even if they do purchase, unless it is a second home or you happen to be part of urban elite, it's very rare that couples actually go in for joint property registration, right? Usually property is in the name of the man. In fact, across sub-Saharan Africa and in certain parts of India, there's a common saying that says that a woman herself is a property. How can property own property, right? That once you're married, you're actually considered as belonging to the man. Right? So anything that, so you yourself don't have property rights, right? So very, very more often than not, house, land, any other form of real estate, cars, even mobile phones, sometimes are just considered man's property. It's registered in the name of the man, maybe not so for mobile phones, but high valued assets are in man's name, right? So in this situation, a woman faces a double whammy. In many countries which are under separation of property, the double whammy, you're not out in the labor market, you're not able to have independent source of income and property, and there is separation of property, which means that for all the women who are out there who are actually contributing to the marriage through their domestic work, through social reproduction, right, that contribution is nullified, right? There are countries which recognize non-monetary contributions to marriage. There is a law, but India is amongst a set of countries that doesn't recognize it. Right? So if you actually look at this map of marital property regimes across the world, you'll find full community of property is there in many of the South American countries. It's there in the Eastern, partial community of property is there. Full community of property is relatively rarer, but there is separation of property in India, United States, Australia, and in Northern Africa and some countries in Southern Africa as well, right? So the separation of property regime is really invisibilizes women's contribution to marriage and also doesn't quite understand how patriarchy might operate in terms of property rights in terms of title deeds, in terms of legal documentation, and what have you. Of course, you can go to the court, and on a case-by-case basis, it can be decided who gets what, etc. But those are time-consuming processes. Of course, you also have prenups, but which can override the default. But prenups are really meant only for the billionaires and the millionaires, or people with very high net wealth, which I think 99% of us are not. And then inheritance again becomes key for ownership of immovable property, again agricultural land. So for inheritance, there are two things to think of. One is equal inheritance rights for daughters and sons, and equal rights for surviving spouses to inherit. Right. So what the second point actually means is that if a man dies, can a woman inherit his property the same way as if she dies intestate without writing a will? Can he inherit the same way as the property in the same way? Right. So inheritance rights for children, except for some North American countries and the MENA region and a few couple southern countries in Southern Africa. Yes, equal inheritance rights for children. Girls can inherit just the same as boys. And there is inheritance rights of spouses, which again is very similar. It's almost mapping onto the same kind of way, right? But if you look at, say, the inheritance rights of spouses combined with, if spouses don't have equal inheritance rights and it's combined with partial community of property, then it's very problematic for women, right? If they happen to outlive their husbands, then what happens, right? What happens is that suppose in India, a man dies, he has a wife and 2 children. Under partial community of property, it goes 1/3 to both his children and to his spouse, right? So you have 100 rupees that's divided equally between 3 people. Whereas if there was some even partial community of property, then she would automatically be owner of the 50%, and the remaining 50% of the man would be equally divided between the spouse and the 3 children. So the spouse is actually in a far more secure position in the sense that she has 50% plus 1/3, 50% that is her own plus 1/3 what she would get from her husband, right? The other problem is, and I haven't shown that here, is what is the testamentary freedom that you have. Many countries around the world actually restrict the testamentary freedom that you have to completely will away your property, right? In India, it's only ancestral property that follows certain rules. If it is self-acquired, if you make a will, you can completely circumvent the law. You can will everything that you want to sons. You don't have to leave anything for your daughters. You don't have to leave anything for your spouses, right? These laws only apply if you die intestate. Are there restrictions on your testamentary freedom, which is again very important to think about when you talk of how assets are accumulated? So some countries in the world have testamentary restrictions, but India doesn't have testamentary restrictions, which actually has proven to be problematic. It's one way in which people can ask for partition of ancestral land, and once it's partitioned, it becomes independent, and then you can have, then you do have freedom over how you will, what kind of will that you can write, right? Also, there is, even though we have these sort of legislations, I'm talking only now about the HSA, the Legal Succession Amendment Act, studies have shown that it has been particularly hard to implement. The bureaucracy is unwilling, the local parties are unwilling to actually have succession certificates where women's rights to ancestral property are upheld, and women themselves are very hesitant to ask of property from their natal households because they fear a rupture of social relations, and the natal support becomes very important to women who sort of married and gone away, right? So it's really sort of a mix of social norms and how that's impacting legislations. And in terms of markets, women are again disadvantaged, like I said, largely because of their earnings both at the extensive margin and the intensive margin. And when women do work, there's a gender wage gap. They are at the lower end of the skill and of the education spectrum. They have restricted economic opportunities, right? So this really compromises their ability to save and their ability to participate in the land market. Right? And also, they are often disadvantaged with respect to access in credit markets. Right? So, broadly, to summarize, I think what I wanted to say is that it's not as if there's only social norms out there that are discriminating against women. We have enough and more of state-sanctioned legislation, discrimination against women still exists via legislations and policies that limit women's employment opportunities and their opportunities to acquire assets in wealth. And these legislations and policies and workplace policies not only devalue the tremendous contribution that women make to the economy, but they also fuel gender stereotypes, both of men as breadwinners and women as caregivers, right? So so-called gender neutral norms can also be regressive. And then when you have norms that privilege only mothers over fathers, that give only women flexible working hours. And actually, a study in US by Claudia Golden has shown that flexible hours really will hurt women because often at the high end of the earning spectrum, there's a non-linear relationship with the hours of work that you put in and how much you earn. So if you work 2 hours, you don't make double. If you work 10 hours, you don't make 10 times, you probably make 20 times because you're always available, right? So fundamentally, something has to change about what is there, about what is considered as an ideal employer, right? Can the state do something about it? Well, I don't know. Can you limit working hours? Can you say don't hold networking events that at crazy hours? Or can you have then publicly provided childcare? If there is a dinner that is organized by my company, are they also going to organize childcare so I can turn up just as well as my neighbor who probably doesn't have a child, right? So how can we think both about legislations and policies? So what we need from governments through legislations and policies to signal that women are capable economic agents who need effective rule of law to function to their full capacity, not a paternalistic government which tells me what I can do as a woman and what I cannot do as a woman. That's it. So I'm done. I will turn off share.
Yeah, so thanks, Hema, for the presentation. So now we have a question and answer session. So those who are watching this on YouTube, you could send your questions to cpp@iimb.ac.in, and we will pick those questions from there. And those who are on Zoom, you could indicate if you want to ask a question, and it will be better if you can speak directly. So we have one question so far, Hema. So Karan Singhal has a few questions. So he appreciates the presentation and makes a remark that it is focused on the top 30% income group of the organized sector. I believe this is relating to your initial discussion about the maternity leave policy and those issues, which are probably applicable to those who are employed in the organized sector. So he asks, what about the bottom 70%, which I believe is because of the unorganized sector, right? So that's the first question. The second question is, how does gender inequality relate to income inequality? And the third and the final question is about IITs and IIMs. So he asks, when will the IITs and IIMs grow out of their elitist focus? Because most students and professors from 5 to 8% income group and research focused on the top 10 to 30% income group. So those are the three questions.
Okay. Should I take these now?
Yeah. Please.
Right. Yes, of course, the Maternity Act, as you rightly pointed out, affects only the formal sector, right? That's a huge problem. What is there? Like when I said, we're starting off with legislation that exists for the formal sector, but I also pointed out that there are a lot of companies in the formal sector that are very small, that are not able to afford this kind of legislation. The larger problem that exists is the huge informalization, the huge contractualization of the workforce, which is a huge macro issue and which is a huge structural problem. And within it, and that affects men and women in very vulnerable situations, and within it, it affects women even more. So yes, can we use ICDS to strengthen our Anganwadis? Can we have public daycare facilities? So when I was talking about the idea of public daycare facilities, that's not something that would be accessible only to formal sector, right? That would be something that would be accessible to both men and women across the income spectrum, right? I hope that sort of takes care of your first question. And gender inequality relate to income inequality. I think I sort of alluded to that in my presentation right up front. There's discrimination in education, right? And that's really starting from sort of the cradle till the end of it. It's talking about it's about who is educated. Problem here is that we don't have good public schooling, right? So if there are resource constraints and the boy gets educated, boy gets sent to private school. So gender inequality from the cradle really leads to income inequality all down the line. The kind of messaging that the girl gets, whereas the kind of messaging that the boy gets in terms of aspirations, in terms of education, in terms of developing your skill set, right? I think if you spend enough time on the IITs and the IIM webpage, you will find that a lot of faculty actually work across the spectrum. Yeah, some of it is elitist, or what you might call elitist, and some of it is doesn't have to be necessarily elitist, right? It's I think what um, if you actually just look at my own work, you'll see that it's talking about men, women, and labor force participation across an entire spectrum. So I'd suggest maybe spend a little more time.
Okay, we have another question from Svecha Kuladi. So she asks two questions. So the first one is, isn't it important for men to internalize care responsibilities in the first place for paternity leaves to serve their purpose? So that's the first question. The second question is, are there any paternity or maternity leaves for homo or heterosexual couples wanting to adopt?
Okay. Yes, you know, this is a chicken and an egg problem, Switcha, in terms of thinking about, is a man in the organization going to walk up to HR and say, hey, you know what, I have a baby and I want paternity leave, when it's not the norm? Whereas if you think that there is a legislation and there's a message that goes out from HR saying all employees are entitled to paternity leave of 3 months, go home, enjoy your time with your family, right? Who is going to feel more empowered? It's going to be the odd, supremely confident man who's going to go to HR and ask for it. I actually had a friend who went and asked for HR in an organization that I shall not be named, and he was refused. And this was a supremely confident young man who wanted paternity leave, right? So yes, but you know, policies, messages have to come from the top, right? Because the men are also in a rat race. They are going to want to, everybody wants to emulate their peers. So I think if you want to change the norm, the leadership has to come from the top, be it companies, be it HR, or be it governments. Can governments mandate and say there has to be 6 months paternity leave? Yes, of course, there ought to be. Then companies will fall in line. Yes, there is paternity leave for maternity leave for adoptive kids, for adoptive parents, but there are a peculiar set of rules that follow it, that you get X amount of leave if the child is less than 3 months, and X percentage of that X amount if that child is less than 1 year. And I think if the child is slightly older than 1 year, you get no maternity leave at all, which again is a very lopsided way of thinking, because you want time to spend and bond and do childcare. And that should happen irrespective of whether it's your own or whether you've actually adopted the child. So government is kind of stuck in the 18th century. But it exists, but not at the same level.
Okay, thanks, Hema. So we have a third question from Hari Natarajan. So he's asking if you have anything to comment on the gender budgeting exercise that the government had adopted. So he says that he knows that it did not do much in the energy sector, but whether it was implemented better in any other department of the government.
Good question, Hari, but I must apologize, a total lack of knowledge in that area. So I'm not going to comment on it. I don't know much about gender budgeting, completely outside the purview of what I normally do.
So we have another question. So I just read it. You said that the government can step in to provide the unpaid care that women provide. Children and elderly constitute a considerable proportion of the population. How can policymakers or researchers convince a government to use public money for this? Because it can have backlash from an economic perspective. Moreover, in a country like ours, where even young members view feminism as an unfair advantage to women. I think this is asked by Santoshi.
Okay, all right, I can also see it in chat. So let me try and take this in two parts. It's a longish question. Considerable proportion of the population. Yeah, see, you can use public money. I mean, actually, you can use public money and generate jobs. Nobody is saying that this has to be free, right? Can you have elderly care that is provided through jobs? Can you have people who will come in and take care of elderly care? But if it's a low income family, they don't fork out, but the government forks it out a little bit, or you supplement it a little bit. I don't think, I think you just have to be a little more imaginative about it. Nobody is saying that everything has to be free, but can there be some subsidies that are rolled out while also doing employment creation, right? We keep talking about that there isn't enough employment. Why aren't you creating more employment in the care sector where women are slaving away? A, it will open up women to actually go out and work, and B, it will also generate employment for younger people or for others who are interested in these kinds of jobs. Can you think of some sort of a resource sharing model? I don't have a complete answer for this from looking at it from a financial point of view, but one has to be imaginative in terms of how this would work, right? It can work, it has worked in countries. So it's not as if it's a deficit in finances that's stopping us. I think these are policy choices that we make with lack of imagination, or the fact that the government thinks that we just systematically have to move away from the care kind of work. In a country like ours, where even young members view feminism as an unfair advantage to women, well, I'm not quite sure what that means, why feminism is viewed as an unfair advantage to women. I think you are probably thinking of certain processes, probably confusing between gender equality and gender equity. If there is some limited affirmative action for women because it recognizes that the field is not yet fair across men and women, and that they require a boost to help them recognize their economic opportunities, then I think that's probably you're thinking in terms of affirmative action, right? So beyond that, I'm not quite sure why it is seen as an unfair advantage to women.
Okay, Hema, I think Balakrishna has a question about government giving equal recognition to both men and women for the same kind of jobs like pilots, bus conductors, etc. But in unorganized sector, recognition is not seen. So how can this be corrected apart from having government intervention through laws?
Well, you know, it's not just, you're right, the government cannot discriminate, right? I am an IIM and my salary is the same as that of a male professor, right? I don't have to worry. But if I was in a private company, discrimination could be there. So there is sort of, there is no anti-discrimination that way that can happen in private companies. It's also in the unorganized sector. How can you do it except through laws? I guess through greater transparency, even if you don't have, say, laws that mandate equal wages for equal work in the unorganized sector, through greater transparency, can you do think of ways in which gender audit might be conducted in smaller organizations, maybe greater collectivization of labor, trying to understand, not have these kinds of non-disclosure agreements, which are largely more for the formal sector, but not for the informal sector, greater awareness. I think that's all kind of what I think might work.
Okay, so if there are any questions from the attendees on the Zoom, please you can unmute yourself and speak up. So in the meantime, Hema, I have a question kind of related to what you said and some of these questions that were raised. So if we take this example of public daycare facility, right? I mean, so we are talking about things which are, where there is this interplay between economic and cultural factors. So from an economic perspective, having a public daycare facility seems to be a win-win solution, right? Because it can lead to employment generation, but at the same time, it can free up women's time, they can participate in the labor market, etc. But at the same time, we have seen, especially in the context of India, that when household income goes up, women have a tendency to withdraw from the labor market because of all the processes, gender norms related stuff that goes on. So from that perspective, if we are thinking about public daycare facility provision, what would be the demand versus supply side aspects of it? Like, will there be enough demand? I mean, as the economy prospers in the kind of society we have, or if you want to make a case of policy, then maybe supply should start first. There may be some policy, but will there be enough demand? Or so if you have anything to reflect on this matter.
Yeah, that's a good question, Soham. I think there will be actually enough demand, maybe not from the really sort of elite class, but even amongst, I think, if you are able to provide good public daycare facilities and make them available across families and even as incomes rise, I think women will want these kinds of facilities in order to work, right? In fact, some of the recent evidence using CMI data, following, I think, a panel of women, is showing that I think it's not so much norms or it's not so much what one calls status production, which is why women are sort of stepping back from the labor force. It's also probably a lack of supply of good jobs. So I think if we think of if we can remove this constraint of a lack of supply of good jobs or the kinds of jobs that women want, and at the same time provide a supply of good, affordable daycare, then I think you will find that the demand is rising, right? I mean, women in India and probably in other parts of the world too are wanting jobs that can help them combine domestic responsibilities as well as being able to go. So if they want a part-time job, if they want jobs closer to their homes, or they want jobs where they don't have to commute a whole lot, or jobs that will do where they can do work at home, sort of very much in the informal sector, if you're talking about piece rate and all of it. But also as women move up, I think some of the older NSS is showing that women who are out of the workforce have demands for a certain kind of job. So can we also solve the supply of jobs problem, the kinds of jobs that women want? Then I think if we also have supply of good childcare, then the demand might arise. And I don't know, what do you think? You've also sort of looked and thought about this, right?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with your point. I mean, yeah, so there is this new evidence about, where the attention is shifting from only norms driving the low labor force participation to the economic causes of it. So I think that needs to be taken into account while thinking about some of these issues. So thanks, Hema. I don't think we have any further question. So I think, if a few very important points that come out of your talk is, on one hand, the fact that gender inequality is often an intra-household phenomenon, right? And which sometimes may make it difficult to notice by the policymaker. I also appreciated very specific recommendations that come out of your speech. For example, I mean, as researcher, I can very much appreciate the need for gender disaggregated data on assets and other things. So if you have any further concluding remark to make, please go ahead.
No, I think the only thing I want to emphasize is let's not always get carried away by norms. I think we have to hold our governments accountable. And the state of discrimination report, I'd encourage everyone to read. It's such an eye-opener for me to see that the Factories Establishments Act and these other laws and notifications discriminate so much against women's ability to work in these small establishments. I think we've just got to push much harder with our governments to change these laws.
So, do you mean that there is a broader political economy angle to it? Like, why is the government not pushing policies towards these issues then?
I don't know that it's necessarily a broader political economy. I think these have just been handed to us for many years ago, and there's just inertia, right? When they've taken it to court, the courts sometimes have overruled, but again, the courts have also sometimes said, oh, these are not fit jobs for women. So there is this view, right, of what women can do and what women cannot do. So, I mean, selling liquor is morally inappropriate. Actually, women might be the best person to sell liquor because they can probably regulate the supply of liquor per person. So I don't know. I mean, it's just laws. I think we need to do a gender audit of government laws and policies.
Okay, so thank you so much, Hema, for this talk, and thank you all for attending this presentation. So we will come back in the next session of our inequality conversations, and I hope to see many of you attend that session as well. So thanks all.